Hello all, welcome to Chandu's TechNet. In our last video that we discussed about how Windows, triggers a failover of your resources, right? Just a recap of what we discussed. So let's consider that you have a Windows cluster, right? So you have a SQL instance installed on this, and you will have a SQL SQL resource that you have created, right? So if you create a resource, any resource you created, that will have a DLL, right? So if for always on availability group, we have something called HADR resource.dll, right? So where this HADR resource.dll, of course, like HADR resource.dll will be hosted on rhs.exe. Right. So HDR resource.dll will be hosted on the rhs.exe, and rhs.exe is on the Windows cluster, right? So rhs.exe is on the Windows cluster, where HDR resource.dll is hosted on the rhs.exe, and you have a SQL server installed here on the same computer. So it's like HDR resource.dll validates frequently to to connect to the SQL server and validate whether SQL server is online or not, is accessible or not, is responding or not. In fact, if SQL is responding, is fine. If SQL is not responding within the interval or within few occurrences, few pings or few checks, then HDR resource.dll inform the same information or notification to the rhs.exe stating that SQL is not responding, right? So SQL is not responding. As soon as rhs.exe receives that signal information from the HDR resource.dll, rhs.exe, which will notify the same to the Windows cluster, stating that the resource is not healthy. If resource is not healthy, then Windows cluster will trigger a failover of your availability group from one node to another node. Again, failover is always depends on your quorum configuration that we will talk in a separate video. I'm not going to cover this quorum configuration in this, but you have a we will cover in a separate video, right? So this is how the failover happens automatically, right? That is the reason we should have to have a Windows cluster to trigger an automatic failover of your resource. It could be either failover cluster, it could be either SQL failover cluster, or it could be either a SQL standalone configured with always on, doesn't matter. So Windows cluster, you should have to support an automatic failover of the availability group, right? So this is how the automatic failover happens, and the requirement for the Windows cluster, the requirement of the Windows cluster. Now, the lease mechanism that we already discussed about the looks alive and is alive that we had earlier. Looks alive check is every 5 seconds it checks whether the service is online or not. In a simple terminology, in simple words, looks alive checks, it connects to the service manager and checks SQL service is online or not. If SQL service is online, then it is fine. If SQL service is not online, then it go for is alive check. So is alive, it validates every 60 seconds and see if the SQL is responding or not. So what happens every 60 seconds? It executes a query called select edit server name to understand whether SQL is connecting or not. SQL is responding for that query or not. If not responding, then it triggers a failover. Okay, go. And so if looks alive failed, then it will not trigger a failover immediately. It will go for a looks is alive check, right? To overcome or to have a better validation or check to fail over the resources, we Microsoft team has introduced two checks called lease timeout and health check timeout. Two checks, right? So let's understand what is lease timeout and what is health check timeout. Right. So let's go here. Okay. So this is the same story that we discussed, right? RHS.exe, where we have right here we have RHS.exe, where we have resource.dll hosted on the RHS.exe, and you have a SQL server. And consider this all on the same cluster, same server, right? Same, not of course like a same cluster, but let's be specific. These are on the same server, only one node on the primary. So that is the reason it uses a shared memory protocol to communicate, because obviously shared memory is a local sharing memory, or so communication within the same server, right? Now, so what is a lease? In general terminology, lease is an agreement between two parties, right? Let's consider lease timeout or mechanism, right? So what is lease? You have two parties. You can consider two, so house owner and tenant. Let's consider just an example. So house owner and tenant. You have a you are so just uh, take an agreement between you and a house owner for a house, right? So for a house, you have an agreement between you and your house owner, right? So what will happen? Let's consider that every 1 year, the lease agreement will be renewed, right? Every 1 year, the agreement will be renewed to make sure that the relation is healthy between you and your house owner or tenant, whatever, right? So the same mechanism, it happens here in the SQL server to make sure that everything is healthy, right? So lease mechanism is nothing but you have a SQL server resource DLL, the same story that we discussed, and SQL server, it has the mechanism of validating the heartbeat between these two. Okay, HADR resource.dll, you have a SQL server, right? So here, of course, like it is a RHS.exe, for example, resource hosting subsystem. You have a RHS.exe DLL, sorry, HDR you have SQL Server.dll, SQL Server.exe, whatever, SQL Server here, right? It opens a shared memory and connects to the SQL Server using a dedicated thread called lease thread. It opens a connection to the SQL Server using a shared memory. Right? So it opens a connection to the SQL Server using shared memory by a lease worker or lease thread or worker. Lease thread or lease worker, it opens a connection to the SQL Server and validates whether SQL is responding or not. If it responds, if SQL is responding, then lease is healthy. Lease will be renewed, or lease is healthy, or resource is healthy. You can consider it that way. So resource is healthy. So if SQL is not responding, or HDR res.ell is not even contacting to the customer, right? So for example, A, sorry. So let's consider that This is giving signal. This is responding to that signal. The same time, SQL Server also giving signal, it has to respond. I mean, so both way, for example, so this HDR resource.ell respond to the SQL Server. At the same time, the communication happens in between these two resource DLL and the SQL Server, right? For example, it will wait, right? For example, SQL will not send any, communication. By the way, for example, it it is a signal, right? For example, it is responding. At the same time, this will wait for the signal, right? So SQL wait for the signal from RHS.exe. If SQL is waiting and our HDR resource.ell is not sending any uh, request or ping, then the issue is not with the SQL Server, right? SQL is ready. SQL is waiting for signal, but this HDR resource.ell is not signaling to the SQL Server, is not communicating to the SQL Server, or is some issue at the RHS.exe or HDR resource.ell or at the Windows cluster itself, right? SQL Server, there is no issue, but there is an issue at the Windows cluster. That is the reason this HDR res.ell is not communicating to the SQL Server. If that is also the case, then we consider that a lease expired. So when lease expired, if any of these two parties are not responding to each other, we consider it as a lease expired, right? First thing, what is a lease? Lease is an agreement between HDR resource.ell and the SQL Server, right? So SQL Server resource.ell, you can consider that, or you can consider HDR resource.ell and SQL Server. And if any of these two are not responding within the lease time, then we consider it as lease is expired, right? So in other simple words, so lease timeout is a lease timeout is a heartbeat between your cluster resource DLL and the SQL Server. You can consider a simple word to answer your question in the interview. What is a lease mechanism? Lease is a agreement between or heartbeat between your cluster resource DLL or your HADR resource.dll to the SQL Server, between HADR resource.dll and SQL Server. If any of these two are not responding with each other, then we consider that a lease expired. How? So if you are, if you are renting your house, right? So it will be a 1-year agreement. So after 1 year, the lease is expired. Lease will be expired, right? You'll have to renew the lease in 1 year, right? The same way, when this lease will be considered as expired. So I'm talking about the lease. When this lease is considered as expired, so there is a time limit called 20 seconds, right? So 20 seconds by default. So you can increase. I'm not going to talk about increasing and all, but let's consider that 20 seconds default configuration, right? So if any of these parties or any of these two resources, HDR res.dll and the SQL Server, is not responding within this 20 seconds, then the lease is considered as expired. Okay, so lease is considered as expired. Then what will happen? Then it triggers. If the lease is expired, then failover triggers from the one node to another node. If the lease is expired, the same information will be shared to RHS.exe. RHS.exe, it sets an event, right? It is just a RHS.exe. It is not a SQL kind of thing. Like it doesn't know like what is, so lease, what is something like it doesn't know. Like so lease is for SQL resource, right? So if lease is expired, then it notifies the same to RHS.exe, and RHS.exe will trigger RHS.exe is set an event to Windows cluster, and Windows cluster will trigger a failover immediately if the lease is expired, right? This 20 seconds, does it mean that, so it validates every 20 seconds? No, so 20 seconds is the upper limit by default. I'm just considering default configuration. This 20-second is the time or limit when the lease is expired. But how the check validation happens, right? These two has to validate each other, right? How frequently these validate each other is the value is divided by 1/4 into 20 seconds, or default value, lease value, right? So what does it mean? If it is 20, 1/4 into 20 is 5. Every 5 seconds, so every 5 seconds, it checks. Every 5 seconds, what happens? This checks whether the SQL is responding or not, or HADR res.dll is sending response to SQL Server or not, right? So this 5 seconds is your heartbeat check. So likewise, it validates 4 times. If fourth time is not responding any of these, let's say for example, 1 is not no response, 2 no response, 3 no response, 4 no response. If it doesn't respond for 20 seconds, it can be anything, right? For example, it is setting an event, right? It is just so telling that I am ready, are you ready or not? Like communication, it will be, it sets an event, it says that I am ready, it says that even I am ready, then communication happens and responded each other. Now, so as I said, it is waiting for signal, right? So it says it is not respond, it is not saying anything, but it is waiting for response, waiting for signal. So this is not signaling, then this is busy, like it wait for 5 seconds, 10, 20, then it says that the response is not happen, then this thinks that SQL is not responding. This says I am not receiving a response from HDR res.dll, but HDR res.dll at the same time thinks that SQL is not responding, right? Definitely, like it is not sending signal, but still it thinks that SQL is not responding within 20 seconds. Then I inform the same to HDR RHS.exe. RHS.exe notifies to the cluster. Cluster will trigger a failover of your resource. That is how the lease mechanism happens, right? So lease is a heartbeat between your resource DLL, that is if it is always on HDR res.dll and SQL Server. So it validates for 20 seconds, right? So the default value for lease timeout is 20 seconds. If SQL or resource DLL is not responding within that 20 seconds default time, then lease considered as expired and the availability group or resource will be failed over to another node, right? So the interview question is, what is lease timeout? Lease timeout is a mechanism, so heartbeat between your resource DLL and the SQL Server, and it validates the health of the response between the resources for 20 seconds. If any of the resource is not responding within the 20-second default value, then the lease is considered as expired. Right. So lease like as I said, like lease will be so monitored by a separate thread called as lease thread. It is not actually monitored, it is kind of so every so operation performed by a worker, right, or thread. So the same thing, it is also performed by a lease, sorry, it is also performed by a thread called as lease worker, right? So if lease is not happen, one thing to remember, it is a dedicated thread, right? So it is a lease thread is a dedicated, I would say, like so high priority thread, right? So it's a high priority thread. So if any issues, so out of your, I would say, like so it is a out of your SQL process thread, right? If any issues at the so lease timeout or something, there are chances of your so like for example system wide issues or some performance issues on the computer, some high CPU utilization, because of that complete system is stuck kind of thing, it caused that issue, right? So it might or might not be an issue with the SQL server, but mostly the issue with the server level, which could cause that lease to be expired, right? So that is how the lease mechanism works. Let me show you that. Right, if you go here, if you go to the properties of this resource, and you have something called properties, that properties, right? So just wanted to zoom in. Right. So if you see here, lease timeout by default is 20,000 milliseconds. That is 20 seconds, right? So by default, it is 20,000 milliseconds, right? So every 1/4 it happens. Every 5 seconds, it validates the check, so heartbeat between the resource DLL and SQL Server. And if it is not responding within this 20 seconds, the lease is considered as expired, right? That is how it works, right? If you can freely increase this value to whatever value if you want, right? So you can increase based on the need, right? So that is the lease mechanism and lease timeout. Now let's have health check timeout. Right, health check timeout is a lease timeout is similar or kind of so looks alive check, right? You can consider that. Now, so health check timeout. So again, health check timeout is somewhat similar to is alive check, but is not exactly. Is alive check just connect to the SQL server and execute select edit server name, right? Health check timeout, right? What happens to the what happens with the health check timeout? This is the same, right? It opens a connection to the SQL server, right? So it opens a connections to the SQL server and execute a query called sp underscore server underscore diagnostics, right? So it executes a stored procedure sp underscore server diagnostics. It is not simple check as is alive, where it whereas it checks whether whether it is responding for the query at its server name, but it has that more detailed understanding, so or detailed regression check, right? You can consider that health check timeout, right? It executes SP underscore server diagnostics and get the report of your checks, right? There are certain checks. We call it as system resource query processing, IO subsystem, system resource query. I'll show you that. One more system resource query process, IO subsystem, I think event or something. I'll show you that, don't worry. Okay. This executes and validate whether these all events are fine or any issue, right? For example, if any issues on these three main events, then the health check timeout triggers a failover of the availability group, right? So again, health check timeout is a check with the SQL check to the SQL server. It open a connection to the SQL server and executes SP underscore server diagnostics to validate whether the SQL is healthy or not. First thing, right? So on what basis it triggers a failover? Based on any of these three events mainly. So IO subsystem and events, it will not trigger a failover, but if any of these resources are so not healthy, so if it is a warning, somewhat okay, but if any of these three are not healthy, then it triggers a failover again. So it also have a time period called 30 seconds, right? So by default it is a 30 seconds and the validation will be 1/3 of health check timeout, right? So 1/3 is the by default value. So every 10 seconds, based on the value that we have, every 10 seconds, 1/3 of the value, it validates, it executes SP underscore server diagnostics. It connects to the SQL server and execute SP underscore server diagnostics to validate whether these resources are healthy or not. That is called health check timeout. If any of these resources are marked as not healthy, then failover triggers. Then the same thing, like it informs to so it informs the same to rhs.exe, and rhs.exe triggers a failover, or notified to the Windows cluster failover happens, right? So how this connection happens, right? So for example, you have rhs.exe, you have something called hadr resource.dll, and you have SQL Server. Okay, so you have a protocol like whatever named as shared memory, that is okay. So the connection, right? It has to connect and execute to the SQL Server, right? It is not just simply whether SQL service is online or not. So no, that is not the check, or SQL is responding or not. No. So it has to connect to the SQL Server and execute a stored procedure. So how it connects to the SQL Server and executes a stored procedure? There is something called a driver. We call the ODBC driver, right? It opens a connection through ODBC driver using a login called NT authority slash system, right? So it opens a connection through ODBC driver using NT authority slash system account. It opens a connection using NT authority slash system account and executes SP underscore server diagnostics. So if it executes SP underscore server diagnostics and retrieve the result, right? Whatever result we have, system, resource, query processing are the main three events. Based on these three, the failover would be triggered, right? If any of these are marked as failure, then the same information will be passed to the RHS.exe, and RHS.exe will be sent to the Windows cluster, and Windows cluster will trigger a failover. Again, this SP underscore server diagnostic, whatever it is, RHS.exe doesn't know. Or system is healthy, resource is healthy, query process RHS.exe doesn't know. RHS.exe only know either it is 0 or 1, right? That is who will be inform them. HDR resource.dll tell that this is 0, this is 1. 0 is failure, 1 is success. If it is 0, then you take action. If it is 1, then we are good, right? If it is 0, then rss.exe notifies to the Windows cluster to fail over the availability group, and that will be failover. The availability group will fail over, or any resource, whatever resource we have, it will fail over. Right. Let's show you that. Let me show you that. Okay. Let's connect to the SSMS. So I'll just show you like how to get that info, right? Like whatever we were executing. So I cannot show like, so how that ODBC opens and all that also I can show, but just to see what events, what are all checks it happens when we when SP underscore server diagnostics executes, right? Just execute SP underscore server diagnostics, STSCS, right? If you execute, right, so it gives that information, right? So whatever, so I told you, right? Let me zoom in. Sorry. Okay. 1 second. Right. Why is that? Okay, let me show you this. Okay, so not this. I think this is visible, but let me see if I can. Okay. Right. So these are the checks that I am talking about, right? Like component name. So if you see that system, resource, query processing, IO subsystem, and the events, right? So these three are mainly major things, right? So if you take these three are the main. So if any of these three events are failed, then the in the so considered as a failure, and it will be going to so either whatever based on the quorum configuration, it triggers a failure of the availability group that we have, right? So just few details of this, and if you just go ahead and execute that, you will have that information here, right? So whatever information, for example, let's say I have maximum worker based on my CPU, right? So this is 512. If I have more than workers, my threads are exhausted. If I have thread exhaustion, then the resource is considered as failure, right? So thread exhaustion, that we will talk later in a different something. And this is query resource, right? Resource is nothing but a memory. So if you have an out of memory exception, so it considered as kind of so not healthy situation, so it triggers a failover. And this is system. If you have any system-wide issues like high CPU or high number of spin locks, you can consider that high number of dumps are generating, right? So if that is the case, the overall system is considered as a unhealthy, right? So then the availability group resource will fail over from one server to another. That's it about so lease timeout and health check timeout. I hope you understand the concept and these interview uh, questions or answers. Please comment or suggest if anything needs to be considered. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye bye.